Get your daughter and get to the back of this plane. Now, before you delay every single person on this aircraft, look me in the eye and say that again. Tell me exactly what you mean by passengers who belong here. Excuse me, you do not get to speak to me that way. Daddy, are they going to make us leave the plane? No, baby. We are not going anywhere. We are exactly where we paid to be. If your father keeps this up, that is precisely what is going to happen to both of you. Do not you dare threaten my daughter. If you have a problem, you look at me, not a 10-year-old child. Sit down and comply, or I will have security remove you from this aircraft in front of every single person in this cabin. Brenda, stop talking. Right now. Stay out of this, Naomi, or I will write you up for insubordination so fast your head will spin. Ma'am, I need you to step away from this passenger immediately. That right there. That was the moment the entire flight changed. That was the moment a woman named Brenda Kessler, senior flight purser for Cascade Sky Airlines, 11 years in that uniform, and 4 of them running the first-class cabin, like her own personal kingdom, reached her hand toward the overhead bin above seat 2A and told a decorated 3-star general to gather his things and go sit in the back of the plane next to the lavatory. She had no idea who he was. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. To her, in that moment, he was just a tall, quiet black man traveling with his little girl, and something about the two of them sitting in seats that cost $11,000 simply didn't match the picture she'd already painted in her head before she ever walked down that aisle. Nobody on that plane knew what was coming. Not Brenda. Not the man she'd already decided to give his seat away to. Not one single soul in that cabin understood that in less than an hour, this flight would not leave the gate. And the woman standing over row 2, so certain of her own authority, was about to lose everything she thought that authority meant. Let's back up, because you need to understand exactly who was sitting in that seat before Brenda Kessler ever laid a hand on that overhead bin. His name was Elijah Warfield, retired Lieutenant General, United States Air Force, 31 years of service, 4 combat deployments, command of an entire fighter wing, a silver star tucked away in a drawer at home that he almost never spoke of, earned for a rescue mission that most of the men who served under him could still recite from memory, word for word, 20 years later. He'd retired 18 months before this flight, and if you'd passed him in an airport terminal, you would never have known any of it. No uniform, no insignia. Just a father in a plain gray sweater, traveling with his daughter to watch his nephew graduate from engineering school in Denver, wearing the only thing on his body that hinted at the life he'd lived, a scuffed, dull steel ring on his right hand, worn smooth from 3 decades of history nobody around him could see. That ring had a story of its own, and it mattered because it's the reason everything that happened next hit as hard as it did. Elijah's father, James Warfield, had wanted to attend the Air Force Academy himself back in the 1950s. He never got the chance. The doors simply weren't open to black cadets, in the way the recruiters liked to pretend they were, and James Warfield spent his whole life carrying that closed door quietly, the way men of his generation carried a lot of things quietly. When his son Elijah earned his own place at that same academy decades later, James saved for 2 years to have a matching ring made. The exact same design he would have worn, had the world let him. He placed it in his son's palm in their living room, handshaking, and told him, "Some doors take a whole generation to open, son." This ring was never really about the ring. It's about the door. James passed away 6 years before this flight. Elijah still turned that ring on his finger sometimes without realizing he was doing it. He was doing it right now, sitting in seat 2A, watching a woman decide, without asking him a single question, that he did not belong there. His daughter, Maya, was 10 years old, in the window seat beside him, tablet already out, legs swinging slightly because her feet still didn't quite reach the floor. This was her first time in first class. Elijah had booked these seats 3 weeks earlier as a surprise, because Maya's only other flight, 2 years back, a cramped red-eye in economy, had left her miserable and cranky for 2 straight days. He wanted this trip to feel different. A real celebration. His nephew, the son of Elijah's younger brother who had passed away nearly a decade earlier, was about to become the first engineer in the family, and Elijah had raised that boy right alongside his own daughter for years after his brother's death. This graduation mattered more than most people in that cabin would ever understand it. Maya had spent the entire week before the flight asking her father questions. Do the seats really turn into beds? Is the food actually different? Do you get real silverware? A child's simple, honest excitement, the kind that makes what happened next land so much harder. Elijah had noticed Brenda watching him during boarding. That specific kind of attention, he knew it well. 31 years of being the only black officer in rooms that expected leadership to look like somebody else had taught him to recognize it instantly. He said nothing. He hoped, the way he'd hoped 100 times before, that it would simply pass. It did not pass. 20 minutes after boarding, with the cabin door still open and passengers still shuffling down the aisle, behind her, Brenda Kessler walked up to row 2 with her tablet in hand and her decision already made. "Sir, I'm going to need this seat back. We've got a passenger who needs to be accommodated up here, and I need you to gather your things." Elijah kept his voice level. He reached for his boarding pass rather than raising his voice. "I purchased this seat 3 weeks ago. My daughter and I are ticketed together. Row 2. Is there a problem with our reservation?" Brenda barely glanced at the pass he offered. Her attention had already drifted past him, toward a well-dressed white businessman standing in the aisle a few rows back, tapping his watch. "There's been a mix-up with the manifest. This seat needs to go to another passenger. I'll have someone walk you to your actual seats. My actual seats are the ones I paid for." "Sir, I really don't have time to debate this with you. We're already behind schedule." That phrase, "mix-up with the manifest," struck at least 4 different passengers nearby as strange, even in the moment. Nobody could explain exactly why a confirmed first-class ticket needed to be surrendered to fix somebody else's unnamed problem. Maya looked up from her tablet, sensing the temperature in the air shift before she understood why. Elijah reached over and squeezed her hand once, a small, practiced gesture. "Stay steady. I've got this." He'd used it with her a dozen times over the years, in a dozen smaller moments just like this one. Across the aisle, a woman named Denise Ashford, an ICU nurse flying home from a medical conference, watched the whole exchange with a knot forming in her stomach. She'd flown this route more times than she could count. She knew what an ordinary seating mix-up looked like. This was not that. A man in seat 3B, laptop open, watched over the top of his screen and said nothing, telling himself it wasn't his business. He would spend the next hour regretting that. Elijah gathered Maya's backpack and his own carry-on without another word of argument, lifted them onto his shoulder, and stepped into the aisle. "Right this way," Brenda said, already turning to wave the displaced businessman toward the empty seat, not even waiting for Elijah to fully stand. "There are 2 seats together in the back that'll work just fine." The businessman, mid-40s, clearly aware something wasn't sitting right, even as he slid into the seat, offered Elijah an almost apologetic glance and said nothing. Elijah took Maya's hand and walked the entire length of the plane behind Brenda. Passengers watched the procession pass, several of them turning back toward first class afterward, with expressions that said they understood exactly what they'd just seen, even if nobody said it out loud. One older man in premium economy, a retired civil rights attorney, as it turned out, caught Elijah's eye and gave him a small, knowing nod. The particular nod of one stranger recognizes another stranger's exhaustion. The seats in the back did not recline. They sat directly beside the rear lavatory, No working entertainment screens. A faint chemical smell drifting from the galley next door. Maya noticed the missing screen immediately and opened her mouth to complain, then closed it again, deciding the day already felt heavy enough without adding to it. She pulled out her tablet instead. She leaned into her father's shoulder, voice low. "Daddy, that wasn't fair. Why didn't you say something?" "I did say something, baby. I just didn't shout it." Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay calm long enough for the truth to catch up to the room on its own. A young flight attendant working the rear galley, Naomi Ortiz, 2 months into this particular route, approached with a bottle of water and an apology that came from somewhere deeper than policy. "I'm sorry about that. That is not how we're supposed to handle a seating issue. I don't know exactly what happened up there, but it didn't sit right with me either." Elijah thanked her. He was more focused on keeping Maya's mood from souring further than on relitigating the injustice with every crew member who happened to walk by. But Naomi didn't walk away and let it go. Something about the quiet dignity in how this man had absorbed an obvious wrong stayed with her the whole length of that aisle, and by the time she reached the front of the plane again, she had made a decision. She knocked on the flight deck door. First Officer Marcus Delgado, 22 years with the airline, opened it with a raised eyebrow that shifted quickly into a frown as Naomi explained what she'd seen. "Describe him," Delgado said. "The passenger. What did he look like?" "What's his name?" "I don't know his name. Black man, traveling with his daughter, maybe 10 years old. They moved him from first class to the last row for what Brenda called a manifest mix-up. It didn't look like a mix-up to me." Delgado had spent 2 decades quietly frustrated with a handful of senior crew members whose judgment he didn't trust, without protocol ever giving him a clean way to act on it. Something about Naomi's description made the hair on his arms stand up. "Wait here," he said, and stepped fully into the cockpit to speak to the captain. Captain Rachel Monroe had been flying for Cascade Sky for 11 years, the last 4 as captain, and had built a quiet reputation among her crews as someone who took cabin conduct seriously. More seriously, some said, than comfort demanded. She listened to Delgado's relay of Naomi's account, with her jaw tightening by the second. Then did something captains rarely bother doing themselves. She got up and walked back through the cabin personally. She moved past first class, past economy, several passengers glancing up in confusion at a uniformed captain making an unscheduled walk to the rear of a plane that hadn't even left the gate yet. She reached the last row. She looked down at the man seated beside his daughter, and she stopped cold. General Warfield? Elijah looked up. Recognition arrived slower for him. Years had passed, but when it landed hard. "Rachel Monroe, I'll be damned. You flew Sky Warrior Squadron out of Nellis. Last I heard you were still active duty. 9 years ago, I hung it up for the airlines. Wanted a schedule I could actually raise kids around." She glanced past him toward the empty first-class cabin, pieces assembling in her mind faster than she wanted them to. "Sir, why in God's name are you sitting in the back of my aircraft next to a bathroom?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He didn't want to make a scene, even now. Naomi, standing a few feet off, answered for him, laying out exactly what she'd witnessed at the front of the cabin. The manifest excuse, the vague scheduling conflict, the businessman ushered into the vacated seat before Elijah had even fully stood up. Rachel Monroe's face went through a transformation right there in the aisle. The warmth of recognition curdled into something considerably colder. "This aircraft is not moving from this gate," she said, loud enough now for the surrounding rows to hear, "until General Warfield and his daughter are back in the seats they paid for, and until I have had a direct conversation with whoever made this decision. Naomi, tell the gate agent we have an indefinite ground hold. I will explain when I'm ready." Word moved through that cabin like electricity through wet grass. Within 2 minutes, Half the plane knew something extraordinary was happening, even if most of them didn't yet know what. Captain Monroe walked Elijah and Maya personally back up the aisle. Not a junior crew member sent to smooth things over, the captain herself, walking beside them the entire length of the plane. Several passengers noted that detail out loud to each other as the small procession passed. At the front, Brenda Kessler was finishing her boarding checklist, entirely unaware of the storm that had just built behind her. She looked up, confused, as the captain approached with the very passenger she'd relocated 15 minutes earlier. "Captain? Is there a problem? I already resolved a seating conflict in this cabin." She said it with the same brisk, rehearsed confidence she'd used the entire boarding process, still fully convinced her decision had been reasonable and closed. That confidence lasted exactly as long as it took Rachel Monroe to open her mouth. "There was no seating conflict, Brenda. There was a paying passenger sitting in the exact seat he was ticketed for, and a decision you made, on your own, to remove him. I intend to understand exactly why before this plane leaves this gate." She turned. "General Warfield, this is your seat. I apologize for every second of this delay." Brenda's face cycled through confusion. Then the word "General" landing somewhere behind her eyes, then something close to panic. "General? I didn't. There was a genuine issue with the manifest I never intended. We will discuss your intentions in a formal setting once we've landed," Monroe cut in, voice flat and final. "Right now, you are going to find that other passenger a different seat, and you are going to do it professionally, or I will have you removed from this aircraft entirely and finish this flight one purser short. Your choice." The color drained out of Brenda's face. Her hands, Elijah noticed as he sat back down, had started to shake. The particular unraveling of someone whose whole sense of authority depended on nobody ever pushing back. Several nearby passengers later said the quiet, level way Monroe delivered, that reprimand landed harder than shouting ever could have. The displaced businessman, deeply uncomfortable now that the scrutiny had swung onto him too, mumbled an apology to Elijah on his way to a different row. Elijah accepted it with a simple nod, more interested in getting Maya settled again than extending the moment. Monroe knelt briefly beside Elijah's seat before heading back to the cockpit. "I am genuinely sorry this happened on my aircraft, sir. That is not who we are supposed to be. I'll be filing a full report the second we land, and I promise you it will be taken seriously." "I appreciate that, Rachel. For what it's worth, you handled that better than most captains would have. I remember exactly why I signed off on your first fighter qualification all those years ago." Monroe allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first real warmth she'd shown since discovering the situation. "You always did have a habit of saying the right thing at exactly the moment somebody needed to hear it, sir. Apparently, retirement hasn't touched that." The plane pushed back from the gate 26 minutes late. The intercom announcement blamed a brief operational matter. Nearly every passenger in that cabin understood by then that it was considerably more than that. But here is where the story could have simply ended. A delay, a demotion, a lesson learned, and where instead it kept going. Because Brenda Kessler was not finished making choices that would cost her everything. Cascade Sky's internal investigation opened the following week. Captain Monroe's report was thorough. Statements from Naomi, from Denise the nurse, from 2 other first-class passengers willing to go on record, and flight deck logs, time-stamping exactly how fast the ground hold had been called, relative to boarding completion. What the investigators found, waiting underneath Brenda's file, surprised no one who'd worked a shift with her. There had been complaints before, 2 of them, filed over the past 3 years, both quietly closed, with no action taken. Colleagues who described her privately as territorial, about first class in a way that went past normal service pride, keeping what more than one flight attendant called an unofficial mental inventory of who fit the image of her cabin and who didn't. One former colleague, who had transferred bases specifically to avoid working under her again, told investigators the pattern had been an open secret for years, tolerated because passengers rarely complained loudly enough, and because Brenda was skilled at making every incident sound like an isolated, defensible judgment call. This time, there was a 3-star general's name attached to the file, a captain's ground hold on record, and 4 independent witness statements that lined up point for point. This time, it did not get quietly closed. Brenda was placed on immediate unpaid leave pending the investigation. 3 weeks later, Cascade Sky terminated her employment outright, citing a documented pattern of discriminatory conduct toward passengers and a direct violation of company policy on equal treatment in cabin service. It was not a quiet reassignment to a desk somewhere. It was the end of an 11-year career, and it followed her, because 2 of the passengers on that flight, including the retired civil rights attorney, had already begun asking questions that would not stay contained to one internal file. Word reached a regional news outlet within the month, not because Elijah wanted the spotlight. He actively avoided it, declining 3 separate interview requests, but because Denise, the ICU nurse, had quietly recorded video from her seat that day. The walk down the aisle, the look on Brenda's face when the captain's voice went cold. She hadn't planned to use it for anything. But when she heard, through a mutual contact, that Brenda was already telling people at her next job interview that the incident had been blown out of proportion by an oversensitive passenger, Denise decided silence had done enough damage for one lifetime. She sent the footage, with Elijah's reluctant blessing, to a reporter who'd covered airline conduct issues before. The story ran with Elijah's name withheld at his request, described only as a retired senior military officer. But Brenda Kessler's name was not withheld, because by then it was already part of a public employment termination record, obtained through a public records request. The airline, facing the story's release, issued a formal public apology, named the incident directly, and announced new mandatory bias awareness training across every hub in its network, effective that quarter. Brenda Kessler did not find work with another airline, not because anyone blacklisted her. Because 2 prospective employers, doing basic reference checks, reached the same colleagues who'd been quietly complaining about her for years. And this time, those colleagues, no longer afraid of retaliation from someone with no power left to retaliate with, told the truth plainly. 6 months after the flight, Brenda showed up, uninvited and unannounced, at a public forum Cascade Sky held for crew members following the new training rollout. The very training session built in part around what had happened on that flight. She sat in the back, arms crossed, until the floor opened for questions, and then she stood. "I want it on record," she said, voice tight, "that I made one decision on one day, and it cost me everything." Meanwhile, that man got an apology, a captain kneeling at his seat, a story in the news. "Where's mine?" The room went silent. Naomi, sitting near the front, felt her stomach drop. But it was Captain Rachel Monroe, invited to speak that day, who stood and answered her directly, calm and unhurried. "Brenda, you didn't make one decision on one day. You made the same decision for years. And 2 separate complaints tried to tell you that before this one ever reached my aircraft. The difference this time wasn't that the man in seat 2A was more important than the passengers you moved before him. The difference is that this time, the truth caught up to you before you could talk your way past it again. Nobody owes you an apology for finally being held to the standard you should have held yourself to the whole time." Brenda opened her mouth, then closed it. Something in Monroe's steady, unangry delivery seemed to land where 3 years of quiet complaints never had. She sat back down without another word and left before the session ended. She never worked in aviation again. Elijah heard about that forum secondhand, weeks later, from Naomi, who called just to update him the way she'd taken to doing every few months since the flight. He didn't feel triumphant hearing it. Mostly, he felt tired, in the particular way that comes from watching a wrong finally answered, rather than simply endured. "You did good telling me that," he told Naomi on the phone. "But I want you to hear something else, too. Don't spend your whole life keeping score on whether people like her, get what's coming to them. Spend it making sure the next Naomi in that galley doesn't have to work up her nerve for 2 months before she says something. That's the part that actually changes anything." Cascade Sky did invite Elijah to speak, once the dust settled, at a training session for new flight crews, not to publicly account for Brenda's failure, a distinction he insisted on before agreeing, but to talk plainly about decision-making under pressure. He stood in front of nearly 40 attendants and gate agents in an ordinary suit, no uniform, and told them he wasn't there to make anyone feel accused. "Every one of you is going to make dozens of small judgment calls today about who gets patience, who gets the benefit of the doubt, and who doesn't," he said. I'm only asking you to notice honestly whether those judgments ever quietly depend on something that has nothing at all to do with the actual person standing in front of you. He told them about the ring on his hand, and where it came from, and what it cost his father to never get to wear one like it. He told them that composure isn't something you're born with. It's something you build one ordinary day at a time, long before anyone's watching closely enough to notice. Naomi sat in the front row that day and caught his eye once during the talk, and he gave her a small, proud nod that she carried with her for a long time afterward. That night, in a hotel room in Denver, the evening before his nephew's graduation, Maya turned to her father with the question that had clearly been sitting in her all week. "Daddy, were you scared when she made us move?" Elijah turned the plain steel ring on his finger, the way he did when he was thinking something through carefully. "Not scared, exactly. Disappointed, if I'm honest. Disappointed that it still happens at all. But I wasn't scared, baby, because I spent 30 years learning that staying calm doesn't mean staying silent. It just means choosing your moment instead of handing it to somebody who's hoping you'll lose control." Maya sat with that a while, tracing the edge of the comforter with one finger. Would it have felt different if Captain Monroe hadn't known you? If nobody on that plane had known who you were? Elijah thought about that question seriously, the way he thought about most things his daughter asked him. Honestly, a little. It's easier when the truth catches up fast, but I'd have been just as calm either way. The calm was never about waiting for somebody to recognize me. It was about not letting somebody else's mistake decide how I was going to act. Maya nodded slowly and reached over and touched the ring on his hand. The same one her grandfather had saved 2 years to have made. The same one worn smooth by 31 years of a career most people in that cabin would never fully understand. "Can I have one of these someday? When I do something that matters enough?" Elijah smiled. The first fully unguarded smile he'd allowed himself since the flight had started. "You don't earn a ring like this by doing one big thing, sweetheart. You earn it by choosing, over and over, on all the ordinary days nobody's watching, to be the kind of person worth trusting with something bigger later. You're already doing that. The ring just eventually catches up to it." She fell asleep not long after, her head against his shoulder, and Elijah sat quietly for a while in the dark hotel room, thinking not about Brenda Kessler, or the ground hold, or the training session still to come. Just about the particular privilege of being trusted with a child's questions about fear and dignity, and getting to answer them honestly. This story is a work of fiction. Every name in it is invented. But the pattern underneath it is not. Imagine boarding a flight with a ticket you paid for in full, sitting down beside your child, and being told to move to the back because someone decided, without asking a single question, that you didn't belong in the seat you were sitting in. Some people spend 30 years building the discipline to absorb a moment like that without flinching. Nobody should ever have to carry that particular skill just to fly home for a family graduation. And some kinds of respect, the story reminds us, take a lot less than 30 years to earn, if people would just look a little closer before deciding who deserves it.